So let's begin with Ukraine, because that's on many people's mind. So here's a kind of impossible question. We could end the war very quickly if the European Union and the United States stopped providing arms to Ukraine. It would be over in 2 or 3 weeks. It's not, I think, by most people an acceptable outcome. But there's also a point of view that says if the only acceptable outcome is a total defeat of Putin and Russia, that's maybe desirable, but politically, etc., are you able to articulate what you would imagine could be an acceptable, a reasonable way that this war would end?
Well, this is to the Ukrainians to say. The Ukrainians has been aggressed. Ukrainians are defending their territory, their independence, their sovereignty. It's not up to me to say what do they have to accept or not. But this question is so often, people ask me, friends and not so much friends, putting this question. And yesterday in the United Nations, for example, there were some leaders who are saying, you are incentivizing the war. On supporting Ukraine, you are making the war longer. You are incentivizing the war. Stop supplying arms to Ukraine. And when I discussed with them, I said, okay, if I stop supplying arms to Ukraine, the war will finish soon, very soon. But how the war will finish? Because the question is not finish the war, but how this war finish. Do you want Ukraine to surrender? To put the government in Kiev as the one who is in Belarus? Do you want the Russian army in the borders of Poland? Do you want the Ukrainians abiding by the Russian domination? Do you think it doesn't matter for you? This is the real question that the public opinions on Europe and the US has to ask themselves when they say, I want to finish the war. Me too, I want to finish the war. And you know who wants to finish the war more than anyone else? The Ukrainians. The Ukrainians want to finish the war. But the question is not when, but how. And the war cannot finish by the surrender of Ukraine. It has to finish with a just peace, in which the aggressor withdraw from the occupied territories, Ukraine recover full sovereignty, and the aggressor has to pay by the damage caused, and the responsible have to pay for their responsibilities. This is the way I see the end of the war, knowing that I don't know when it's going to happen. But one thing is sure, dear professor, if Putin could have imagined when he launched the war, then 1.5 years later, he would be in the situation he is now, I'm sure he would not launch the war. Because it's a great failure for Russia. Russian army has lost 2,000 tanks. Do you know how much is 2,000 tanks? It's more than all European armies together. The number of casualties, and there is official, unofficial figures, but it's terrific. So it's a big moral, political, and military failure already for Russia. Already. And Putin cannot travel abroad because he has the risk of being detained by the International Criminal Court. So I'm sure when he launched the war, he was not expecting that.
I have sympathy for this position, but it means the Ukrainians will decide, and I have sympathy for the Ukrainians. This was an aggressor's war. They took over territories, etc. But as you said, and rightly so, for this to go on, the European Union and the United States have to continue to arm them. The United States until now has spent $78 billion in support for Ukraine, and if we take the Union and the member states of the Union, it's the same order of magnitude.
The same, yes.
It's the same order of magnitude, contrary to what some people say. In fact, if you count the support of all the member states of the European Union together, it's even a little bit larger than what the United States is giving.
Less military, more civilian.
But there's not this huge gap. In the United States, I already see cracks in the public support. It's $200 million a day for every day of the war. What's the situation in Europe? Because I want to involve another question. You are not just, so to speak, the foreign minister of the European Union to the rest of the world. You also have internal diplomacy. To get positions, you have to have 27 member states agreeing, and like Orwell said, they're all equal, but some are more equal than others. Is the situation in the European Union, as you read it, such that this level of support, not for another week or another 2 weeks, but credibly to say, as long as it lasts, do you have that kind of support, both at the popular level and at a ministerial, governmental level?
Well, it depends. It depends a lot of causes. If we do nothing, maybe, well, Putin believes that democracies are weak. Democracies are fragile. Systems of public opinions, at the end, the public opinions get tired. And that's what he's expecting. He's expecting that we get tired, stop paying for Ukraine. My gardener told me the other day, in my house in Madrid, he was phoning me that something was happening in the garden. He told me, by the way, why should I pay for Ukraine? By the way, where is Ukraine? He had not a clear idea of what it was about. It depends on what the pedagogical capacity of the politicians, the ones who take decisions and need the support of the people. Today in Europe, because we live in democracies and public opinion systems, today in Europe, according with the polls, with Eurostat, 80% of the population supports. This is not equal in all countries, and not across the political spectrum. The far right and the far left are less enthusiastic than other parties. There are members of the European Union who says every day we have to reconsider our support to Ukraine. But they still vote in favor of that. Because as you know, you are an expert on European law, we need a unanimity. I need the 27 agree. And until now, the 27 have agreed. Not only on military support, only on the biggest package of sanctions against the Russian economy and Russian leadership. And I think by the time being, it continues. I cannot tell you what's going to happen next year, but it will depend on our capacity to explain to our people the causes and consequences of this war. Nothing comes automatically.
So part of your siesta was conditioned by the fact that Europe for decades did the butter because they had at the back of their mind the American cavalry that would come in case of a disaster, as happened twice in the 20th century. Do you think now in retrospect that fatal decision, or maybe a happy decision, in the early 50s, where the French Parliament voted against the European defense community, in retrospect was a mistake? Do you think, a more delicate question, that Russia poses a security threat to Europe? And do you think that Europe is equipped to deal with it?
I think I have to start writing my memories. Look, the first question, maybe you don't know, but before the Rome Treaty, before we created the economic union, the economic communities, we tried to go through the military way. And we tried to create the European army. And it was a proposal, a treaty, signed by France and Germany. But this was an American idea. This was pushed by the US, because the US needed someone to support them on facing Russia, Soviet Union. What a better idea than to have an European army. So let's put the German and French together. And the government signed the treaty. But then the French parliament said no. It was a combination of the Gaullists, who didn't consider a good idea to have a French soldier under the command of a German officer immediately after the war, and the communists, who were not a good idea to have something facing the Soviet Union. And they said no. The history would have been completely different if I had said yes. But at the end, maybe it wouldn't have been a good idea. Because in the 50s, to put the idea of Europe 100% on the military side would have not created the European demos that we have been building through economics, integration, sharing, trade. I think for the building of that European demos, it has been better, although longer, to go through the civilian side. Then, which was the second question?
So I said, now, do you think, if you're able to say that Russia actually poses a security threat to Europe in a way that one can't just talk about it in some seminar room, but that should worry policymakers?
Yes, certainly. Russia is a security threat for Europe. And this security threat is much more understood in Vilnius than in Lisbon, for geographical and historical reasons. Certainly, you go to the Baltic states and you say, is Russia a security threat? They will tell you, yes, it is. I've been deported to Siberia twice in my life. If you go to the south of Europe, they will say, yes, but in a more intellectual way. But yes, today Russia is a security threat for Europe.
And is Europe equipped to deal with that? Politically, militarily? Because it's easy to say, yes, they pose a security threat. But what are you willing to do about it? In terms of, if we look at the combined defense expenditure of the member states of the European Union, it's greater than that of Russia. But if we look at the effectiveness, it's...
Well, we spend in defense 4 times Russia. 4 times Russia, and equal to China. Effectiveness, well, the effectiveness of the Russian army doesn't look bright. Huh? So from the point of view of effectiveness, there is a lot to talk. But look, there is not alternative to NATO for the territorial defense of Europe. That's clear. There is no alternative to NATO.
And when you say NATO, it means the United States?
Mainly, but also the others. Yes, certainly. When we talk about European defense, I am in charge of building the European common defense. But I know very well that the territorial defense to face this Russian threat, there is not alternative to NATO. Which doesn't mean that Europeans should not develop their own security capacities. Because there are some issues that NATO will not solve. What's happening in the Sahel today, for example? I don't expect NATO to go to Niger. So we have to have our own capacities, because the more capable we will be, stronger will be NATO. So there is no contradiction between Europeans developing their security capacities and NATO, because we are part of NATO. If we are stronger, NATO will be stronger. It's not an issue of substituting NATO by the European Union, because we are not a military union.
Let's put Ukraine aside for a minute and go to no less complicated issue, the Israel-Palestine situation. So the occupation has lasted 70 years. The violations of human rights, etc., become worse and worse. In other words, it's not just the fact of the occupation, but also the practice of the occupation. And now, to complicate matters even further, the current Israeli government is in rapid democratic slide. We have parties in the government with key ministerial positions which make AfD in Germany or Vox in Spain look liberal. So 2 questions. A, historically, do you feel that Europe really did enough, carried sufficient weight to try and bring about some kind of solution? And I say the solution in the sense of it's always been the European policy since the Venice Declaration in the 80s, a 2-state solution. Has Europe, apart from saying that's the desirable solution, really used the leverage that it has? And B, do you think in the current situation is Israel, with the current government, etc., maybe there should be a change of policy?
Well,
hard question.
Yeah.
Minefield.
Yes, minefield. I spent the last 2 days, even this afternoon, discussing at the UNGA with the Israelis, with the Palestinians, with the ad hoc liaison committee chaired by Norway. With this meeting, I push for of Egypt, Jordan, Arab League, Saudi Arabia, in order to try to discuss and to take out of the siesta the peace process. Look, it is 30 years of the Oslo agreements. On the 13th of September, the Oslo agreements were signed. And this Oslo agreement were the basis for the two-state solution. At that moment, there were 280,000 shelters, Israeli shelters, in the Palestinian territories. 280,000. Today, there are 700,000. So is it still viable, the two-state solution? Some people say it's no longer viable. I believe that there is not there is not a better solution than that. Because if there is not the hope of building a two-state solution, which is the solution? And that's why I think we have to continue trying to build the solution, knowing that this, with everybody says we want a two-state solution, and the Palestinians say, what are you doing to do in order to make this solution possible? In Europe, there are many member states that for historical reasons will be very reluctant to push Israel, to criticize Israel, to ask Israel to fulfill with their obligation in the Oslo Agreement for historical reasons. The Shoah is still in the memories of many people.
But that has always been the policy, very reluctant for all the reasons we know, etc. And if I may be allowed to press you a little bit, at what point does it reach that you have to lose a bit of that reluctance?
Well, I personally don't have this reluctance. But I know that most of my colleagues, I am very much in favor of providing Israel with the security Israel deserves. And all the Europeans are engaged in providing Israel securities. But I'm thinking about the states who were directly responsible of the Shoah and other events, tragic events that are still there. But I think that we Europeans maybe we let the Americans to lead the game. The problem is that now the Americans seem to be in a clear retreat. They're no longer taking the lead. And that's why the system has become a kind of a stalemate in which the number of shelters increases, the number of evictions of Palestinians increases, the number of destruction of their houses increases. Yes, we protest and we issue statements, but the fact is this trend continues, and one way or another, the international community has to look at that problem. Otherwise, yes, at the end, the two-state solution will not be a solution. And then which will be the solution?
When you say the international community, in real politics, that means the United States?
It means United States and others. You know, one of the big criticisms that I am facing when I'm talking about the war in Ukraine is the double standards. Double standards. You blame Russia for violating United Nations Charter. And what about Palestine? How many people in the UNGA will repeat that? And why don't you feel so much concern about the occupation of the Palestinian territories, the violation of United Nations resolutions? And I have to admit that this is real politics, that on this issue we deserve a certain blame.
You mentioned the United Nations, the international community. Let me change register a little bit. Let's think of the Security Council, and especially of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. We are in a law school. We have the veto power. Does it still make sense to have the United Kingdom as France, not to have a single African country, There are all kinds of talks of reforming the Security Council, but meaningful reform would be reforming the 5 permanent members with the veto. Maybe here you can express a personal opinion, if you're allowed to. And if not, what is the position of the European Union on reform of the Security Council?
We are very much in favor of reforming. But I don't know many volunteers to abandon his seat in the Security Council. Look, what I was saying about the Global South. When the world order that we appeal, the rules-based international order, when many countries of the Global South listen to this sentence, says, and who wrote this order? Because when this order was built, I was not there. Either because it was a colony, it was not even an independent country, or because it didn't exist economically. China didn't exist economically, and in Africa, in Southeast Asia, even in Latin America, the political capacity of many countries that today are very important, at that time they were not. And that's why they asked for recognition. And they said, look, this world order doesn't represent the world the way it is. And they want to have a saying. And sooner or later, we will have to understand that we have to reform financial institutions and political institutions in order to accommodate to the new situation of the world. But I know how difficult it is. You know, it's the same thing that inside the European Union, the unanimity rule. Everybody says, yes, it will be better a majority rule. Oh, but then I will lose my veto power. Well, then let's think about it. It's a matter of having the capacity of influencing and the political capacity of deciding is something.
But one solution that is discussed, I don't see France giving up its position as one of the 5 permanent members. I don't see the United Kingdom, especially now, giving it up. But one proposal is to enlarge it, to have instead of 5 permanent members, 7 permanent members.
Yes.
Africa, from Latin America.
Yes, but the Security Council in the last years has been completely useless because they haven't been able to agree on anything.
They have a history of not agreeing on anything.
Yes, but especially in the last years, Russia veto for everything. The Security Council is unable to take decisions. So if you increase the number of members and you keep the unanimity, it's still going to be more difficult to have agreements. So you need an operational body, something able to take decisions, because today there is a permanent veto for everything.
Paradoxically, it's the fact that it doesn't decide on anything might make it easier to simply say there's a symbolic statement that it's not the victors of the Second World War who are still dominating it. I want to totally register and then get back to these big world affairs. You were foreign minister of Spain. It's not a trivial country. And now you are the high representative of the European Union. Tell us a bit the different experience between the foreign minister of Spain and being the high representatives of the European Union. Just really in a personal way. So it's not a kind of functional analysis, an experiential thing.
So you really want me to write my memories right now, huh? Look, a ministry of a state is a ministry of a state. A high representative of the European Union is not a ministry because the European Union is not a state. My role is the consensus builder. I cannot decide. I am the representative of 27, and I need the agreement. And that's why it's so remarkable that in front of the war in Ukraine, we have been able to have this unity. This is really remarkable. I never could imagine that quickly we decided to go to arm Ukraine, the 27 altogether, and we still are united. So the High Representative of the European Union is the representative of a club of 27 member states. Each one has its own point of view and keeps its sovereignty. The foreign policy is not a community policy. Each one has its own. And to build something common, everybody has to agree. So you are not really a Minister of Foreign Affairs for Europe. You are the representative of the 27 when the 27 agrees. And when they don't agree, then you send messages that represent yourself. The Minister of a State, not a trivial state like Spain, thank you for that, certainly not a trivial state, it's a minister. Well, it's not the same thing to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany than to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs of another small country. Certainly not. And that's why we need more unity. When I'm saying I am a consensus builder, I am a unity builder, it's because I have the strong feeling after 4 years, or almost 4 years in the job, that non-European state, even the bigger, counts on this new geopolitical landscape.
So, to go back to the personal again, because that's one of the advantages when we invite, and nobody has ever said no, somebody to give the State of the Union, we say we prefer a chat. Because if you give a lecture, A, it will have been written by an assistant, and B, you can't talk about yourself, and in a chat. So I've often wondered the following. If you're the Foreign Minister of Spain, it's a sense of power. It's a big, important member state in the European Union, and the High Representative at the time has to come begging you, I need consensus, etc., and that's a sense of power. As High Representative, you don't have that power, but maybe what you're doing is more important, a sense of greater accomplishment.
Yes. No, yes, I am not joking. Yes. Why? Because I know that the European position in the world has much more weight than the position of a single member state.
Unless you're the United States. I'm teasing.
No, because certainly the United States is one state. And we are not a state. And sometimes people ask to the European Union to do things that the European Union cannot do, because nobody provided with the tools and the legal capacity on doing that. We are a club of states. Each one keeps its sovereignty, keeps its army, keeps its foreign policy. Something has been communitarized, something, but others not.
So just one more question on this sort of experience of being High Representative. What was the best moment in your experience, and what was the worst moment?
The best moment I remember very well, when 24 hours after Russia started bombing Ukraine, or 36 hours, no more than that, I took the phone and I managed quickly to have all the member states behind the idea of providing arms to Ukraine, which has never happened before. Never happened before that the European Union could use its budget to provide arms to a country at war. And when I realized that the 27 agreed on that, I said, Eureka, good, we did it.
And there's something really interesting here, because from a legal point of view, it's not the European Union that's providing arms, it's the member states of the European Union. But I don't think I'm speculating, if there wasn't the European Union, we wouldn't have that kind of commitment. It wouldn't be that kind of mobilization. It wouldn't have that kind of impact. What's your worst moment?
The worst moment was... the worst moment. There have been so bad moments that to choose the worst... choose the worst is really difficult. But maybe the worst moment was when I went to visit Moscow.
When you went?
To visit Moscow.
Uh-huh.
Moscow, the day in which Navalny was being in front of the trial. Navalny was being judged. Well, judge is a way of saying, no? He was being in front of the trial that condemned him to I don't know how many years. And I decided to go to Moscow to explain to the Russians that this was not a good idea and to criticize them openly. Many people told me, don't do that. They're going to kill you. Don't do that. Don't go. And I said, well, why not? If this is the moment to go something, it's now, no? And I went, and I had a clash with the Minister Lavrov, that since then is very nice with me. He's all the time talking about me and blaming for the war in Ukraine and everything. And I remember that he told me, are you going to talk about Navalny? Yes. If you talk about Navalny, I will talk about the problems in Spain about the Catalan independence. And I said, okay, do it if you want. I am not going to contest you. I'm not going to reply you. I'm not going to discuss with you about it. But I think I have to tell you in front of you in a difficult moment like this what we Europeans think about the way you treat the opposition. It was not easy.
I will make it easy for you. I will not ask you about Catalonia.
This is an internal affair of a relevant country, and I cannot go into internal affairs.
You are not only High Representative, you are also Vice President of the Commission. So I want to ask you of some major issues of the European Union within Europe. And the two are a little bit connected, but I'll separate. The first is the growth of Euroscepticism. Even 15 years ago, Eurosceptics were on the lunatic right and the lunatic left. There was, if you look at Eurobarometer, today Euroscepticism is mainstream politics. If we look, don't have to mention member states, but if we look, it's mainstream politics. And connect with that is what we call democratic slide, turning back on. There's one member state who openly says, we are an illiberal democracy, which for me is an oxymoron. There's no such thing as an illiberal democracy. So how do you explain these two trends, which are often go together? And that makes your job, of course, more difficult. Because when there's not a shared basic system of values, and when the very idea of European integration is called into question, Marine Le Pen, she won the last elections to the European Parliament. She was this close to winning it's a challenge to Europe. How do you explain it? How do you see it unfolding?
Well, nationalism is on the rise. So that's a fact of life. But I think that at the end, Europeans understand that thanks to the European Union, we could have had what we still have today. I don't think that people would like to abandon the European Union. Look, Brexit. Brexit was supposed to be an epidemic. And it has not been an epidemic. It has been a vaccine. It has been a vaccine. Nobody wants to follow the British leaving the European Union. They criticize the European Union, but they stay inside. They don't want to leave. By the contrary, we have 10 countries queuing to become members of the European Union. 10.
No, I don't think the problem of Euroscepticism is they want to leave. They're smarter. Why should you leave? We have benefits. We have money transfers. We have all kinds of benefits. But Euroscepticism challenges certain policies, the issues of rule of law. So I'm inside, but I have a different vision of what Europe is about. Now we can say easily, well, we believe in pluralism. We even believe in pluralism about what Europe should be. But there really is, when it gets to issues like rule of law, when it gets to issues like human rights, when it gets to issues like migration, it's a challenge.
It is. Certainly, it
and
is.
How do you explain it, and how do you see it unfolding? And maybe that was my second issue I wanted to ask you, is migration. It both unites and divides Europe in good ways and in bad ways.
But migration is the bigger divide among the European Union. And it could be a dissolving force of the European Union. We haven't been able to build a common migration policy, which is quite paradoxical also, because, when you abolish the internal borders, imagine the map of Europe, you abolish the internal borders. There is no border among member states. Then the external border of each one becomes the external border of everyone. We have communitarized external border. If you share the external border, we should share migration policy, because migration is about people coming through the border. And we haven't been able to build a common migration policy because we have different approaches. And this is a fact of life. There are some member states of the European Union who are Japanese style. We don't want to mix. We don't want to mix. We don't want migrants. We don't want to accept people coming from outside. We want our purity. And others, and Spain is one of these, is the result of mixing. We receive every year 600,000 people coming from Latin America to Spain. And the others who have 10% of the population coming from Africa, and they are used to have, and we need migrants. The paradox of Europe is that Europe needs migrants because we have a so low fertility rate that if we want to survive from a labor point of view, we need migrants. The problem is that we have to regulate migration. Migration cannot be something without order. What afraid people is the image of a disordered process, uncontrolled process. We should be able to regulate it altogether. But until now, sorry to say, we haven't been able.
Which is weird, because everybody understands it's not just the labor market, it's the survival of the welfare state. When you have more and more older people and less younger people who are working, paying taxes, etc. So apart from saying we have different approaches, is what accounts for those different approaches?
Culture, a cultural approach, a political and cultural approach. It is a deep cultural feeling. There are member states of the European Union who refuses to open the borders to other people. You are going to get older. Okay, I accept. I'm going to get older. But I don't want to mix.
I want to ask you some questions that some of the students sent me and asked me to ask you. So one student wrote to me and said, yes, I know you're going to talk about Ukraine and China and geopolitics, etc.
We haven't talked about China.
We haven't talked about Ukraine, no, not at all. And how come you didn't put on your list climate, which is such a challenge?
Yes,
existential almost.
I said something about climate. I said that many people around the world believe that our effort in favor of Ukraine is going to be detrimental to our effort to fight climate change.
But do you think Europe is doing what it can do, what it should do? Should it be doing more in addressing climate issues?
I think we do really a lot. Look, today Europe is 8% of the world emissions on a year basis. We are 8%. It means that even if tomorrow we cancel completely our emissions, the problem will remain the same, because there is still 92%.
But there's another less flattering statistic, which says if we look at the ecological load of European corporations, 98% of them are outside the territory of Europe.
Sorry, I don't understand. 98%?
Corporations produce ecological load, emissions, effluent, etc. And when you look at that load created by European companies, 98% is outside the territory of the European Union.
And this brings to a great question. Do we have to account the emissions by the place where the emissions are being issued, or by the consumer of the products that this emission has been producing? Yes, we have been delocalizing our production. We produce outside and we import, and the accounting of the emissions is there, not here. But it's still worse. I said 8% of the year-based emissions. But if you calculate the cumulated emissions from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is what matters, because what matters is how much is up there, then Europe is responsible for 25%. And Africa by 3%, and South America by 3%. By the way, I don't know how these calculations are being made, because to calculate which is the amount of emissions produced in Africa since the early 19th century, I don't know how do you calculate that. But the ones who make this calculation said Africa is 3%. And this explains this resentment when people talk about climate. People say, look, there is a problem. Yes, it's a problem. Who created the problem? Us? No. We are responsible by 3% of the emissions, nothing. And in Africa, there are 600 million people that have never seen an electric bubble. 600 million people that have never seen an electric bubble, don't have electricity. And they are responsible by 3% of the emissions. So you cannot come to these people and say, we have a great problem with the climate. They say, yes, we have a great problem with the climate. Who created that? And this means that we have to increase our cooperation. To increase our cooperation, transfer of technology, financing, because even if we cancel our emissions, and if they don't do, the problem will not be solved. And that comes China. China burns today more coal than the rest of the world together. So there is no hope of solving climate problems without a strong engagement with China. Like it or not, you have to engage with China.
Do you think the United States is doing enough? We are in New York.
Look, the United States has now come with this Inflation Reduction Act, which is the first big step of the US to fight climate change. Until now, they have been quite reluctant.
Europe is not exactly happy with that act.
Because it poses a competitivity problem. Certainly. We have a problem of competitivity with the US, with China. In general, the world is going to a dynamics of state aid. Europe was built against the idea of state aid. Fair competition means no interference of the public in the private. No state aid. But now the world is going to state aids, and the technological revolution requires a lot of financing, and in China, in US, and even in Europe, the tendency is support, public support to innovation and development of the firms.
How would you define, since we came close to home, how do we define, in a realistic sense, the state of relationship between the European Union and the United States? It's complicated. On the one hand, from what you said before, ultimately, when it comes NATO and all the rest, there's still a huge European dependence on American security commitment. On the other hand, on a variety of issues, one doesn't see eye to eye. Where do you construe the state of the relationship?
Well, with the Biden administration, the relations is very good. It was not so good with the previous administration, to tell the truth. But with the Biden administration, the relations is, I think the transatlantic relationship has never been so strong as it is today. Thanks to the war in Ukraine, maybe.
Thanks
to the war in Ukraine. Certainly has catalyzed a closer union, and we have a lot of coordination meetings in order to ensure that we are supporting Ukraine all together in the framework of NATO, but also bilaterally. And even in our world politics, I have with the American administration a very good relationship.
Do you see eye to eye with the United States on China?
On China, at the beginning of my mandate, I said that the Europeans have to follow the Sinatra doctrine. You know Sinatra, no? My way. We will be always closer to Washington than to Peking. We share the same political system, the same economic system. We certainly are united with the US. But it's also true that we have our own interest. Our dependency on China is much bigger. So de-risking, nobody talked about decoupling, doesn't have the same meaning for the Europeans that for the US. Look, on the last 3 years, China has invested in Europe 26 billion euros. In US, 0. The amount of Chinese investment in Europe is very big. The amount of import for China is much bigger than the US. We import from China 20% of all our imports. The US is importing from China as much as from Mexico. A completely different picture. The capacity of our firms to have benefits, to import, export, to invest, depends much more from China than from the US. So this is a fact of life that has to be taken into account.
Is that a delicate way of saying we don't see eye to eye because we've got different interests?
No. We look eye to eye and to discuss, and we talk, and we have a strategic dialogue about China, my services with the US services. And I think that we understand that there is a technological rise of China, that we have to take care of this technological competition. But it's a fact of life that the German industry is much more dependent on the investments in China than the US, no?
Here's another question from a student, and we have to end very quickly. So, Brussels was so energized, the Brussels effect in the information society. It's Europe that essentially shapes the rules of the game across the world. And the student says, yes, that might be true, but that's because the technology is in the United States and China. So the United States and China do the technology, the Alibabas, the Amazons, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Apples, etc. And Europe does the regulation. There's some truth to that.
No, I don't agree with that. The Brussels effect was written before the last push, the last technological push. We were the standard setters because we were technological leaders. You cannot pretend to be the standard setter if you are not the technological leaders. And in some sectors, Europe has been losing a certain leadership, technological leadership. And be sure, if you lose the technological leadership, you will lose the capacity of regulation.
It wouldn't be an
And
interest...
you know one thing in football. Do you like football?
Do I like football?
Yes, a question. Spain is very good at football, especially women.
Are you Real Madrid or Barcelona?
This is the most difficult question you could put to me. No, but look, in Spain we say, ¿cómo se llama el árbitro? The referee doesn't win matches. So the referee doesn't win matches means that the regulator doesn't win the technological race.
It wouldn't be a good fireside chat if we agreed on everything. So on Europe being a technological leader, we'll have to agree to disagree. I want to end...
We have been a technological leader in some aspects.
I have to stretch my memory in this case. Just teasing.
Look, I can tell you, nuclear, high-speed trains, even in telecommunication, we have been leaders. Remember about Nokia, about Alstom. We are no longer, but we have been.
We always finish...
Who produces the machine that produces chips?
Who designs the chips?
I don't know. Who produces the machines to produce the chips is a Dutch company, ASML. The only one in the world that produces the machines that the Taiwanese uses to produce chips.
We'll continue next
Another
time.
day.
But we always end with a few really... So, if somebody goes to Spain, what would be the Spanish dish that you would most recommend they order in a restaurant?
Well,
you have one choice.
I am going to say something that it will surprise you, because everybody expects me to say paella, no?
No, I would expect you to say ventresca de atún.
No. The best dishes is someone coming from Catalonia, which is, in Catalan we say that, espinacs and panses. Espinacs and panses is, how do you say, is épinard? Spinach with raisins.
And who is your favorite, I won't say Spanish, but I'll say Hispanohablante, Spanish language author?
Author?
Author, yes. So it could also be any Spanish writing author.
Isabel Allende.
Pardon?
Isabel Allende.
Isabel Allende.
A Chilean writer.
And your favorite pop group?
The Beatles.
This is a little gift on behalf of NYU School of Law. And I hope you will accept our invitation to come back again. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the audience.
Oh, it has been dynamic, no?